Hello, everybody. This is Ravi from Fraud Technology Podcast. We have with us Asiat. He's joining us from Dallas in the US. And I would love to quickly introduce Asiat. We have the privilege of hosting him. He has been a seasoned fraud analyst and a data enthusiast. He comes from with a background of technology as well. And he has an impressive background in fraud. He has been a fraud team lead for a couple of companies, including Fundbox, A2B, and currently he's at Strike Acceptance, right? And join us to hear about his experience managing fraud teams and also the technology aspects of fraud itself. Welcome, Asset. Nice to see you and nice to have you here.
Thank you, Ravi. It's really nice to meet you, and it's really humbled to be as your first guest on this podcast.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, we are also pretty excited about having you here. This is our first podcast, as you rightly mentioned as well. So lovely to have you. I also noticed that, in your experience, you seem to have started as a technologist. You seem to have a lot of experience doing SQL and queries and data analysis itself, even before fraud or financial services. I even saw oil and gas industry that you worked in before. So I would love to know a little bit about how your journey has been, how the technology has helped you, or what are some of the challenges for you to move from a non-fraud role into a fraud-based role?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I would say that technically, the technology, the technical skills were the biggest parts where, you could switch from one job to another. Formerly, my education was in finance. I focused my education on investments. Initially, when I was in college, I wanted to work for hedge funds, do quantitative trading and those things like that. But then
Mm,
figured out that, you know, uh, some people are more target for those industries. Like if you went to an Ivy League school, it's easier to get in. And if you went to like a public school, then it's harder to get in, but still there are people there. So out of college, I really didn't have any guidance for careers. I just took whatever that was available, right?
mm,
So it's either in investments or like a data analyst for just a tech startup.
mm,
But again, skills like Excel and SQL would be used there. But a main journey to fraud was, I guess I had fraud experience before even I started working for fraud. And it's unfortunately being on the other side of the fraud. And again, I'm not saying I committed any fraud or things like that. But when I lived in New York, for first couple of years, I lived in a pretty low income neighborhood, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people there they do some criminal activities, either selling drugs, or now it's safer than selling drugs. It's fraud, right? You're just there with your computer, buying some identities online and just trying to see if you can apply for a loan or credit card, and things in that sense. And people used to talk a lot about things that they did, they succeeded, this and that. And for me, that time I was just a student. I didn't care much of what was going on the other side, but I would hear a lot about all types of fraud, whether it's against government, companies, anything you name it. So I had a really good knowledge of how people do fraud, right? And then during 2020, when pandemic started, I think that's when lots of people's lives started changing, right? Work from home culture, this and that. And I would read a lot about fraud back in the time, like PPP fraud. People are buying Lamborghinis with PPP funds, right? And I would ask myself, why these companies allowing that to happen? Isn't it easy just to stop it, right? And that's where I was wrong. It's not so easy to stop it because you have a flow of customers and there's lots of groundwork you need to do to stop it, right? So that was my first step into fraud
mm,
prevention,
mm.
and the journey started from there.
Wonderful. I mean, I would love to know the fraud aspects itself, but you mentioned about some of the experiences that you had in your early part of your career. Can I understand what is the time frame that you're talking about here when you observe fraud around you?
So for 2 years, I lived in the Bronx, New York, South Bronx. That would be considered as the worst part of the Bronx, and that's where people wouldn't like to go there. It's known to be dangerous, and but yeah, for 2 years I lived there, and thankfully, while I studied,
Which years would that be?
2014 to
Okay.
2016.
Okay.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
and actually in 2016, so while I lived there, so this is totally off fraud, just a huge life achievement, I would say. While I lived there, I went to school and worked two jobs, kind of minimum wage jobs, but I was able to save some money, right? And studying in finance, you want to be a Wall Street trader, you want to make big bets and this and that. It just happened that I've learned about stock options, call options, and put options, and I put my entire savings in Tesla options, which skyrocketed and helped me to move out from Bronx to a better neighborhoods. So it was mostly luck. I would say I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but life is full of surprises.
Definitely sure that fortune favors the brave. So I'm sure you put your hard work when luck favored you as well. So I wouldn't take away your own contributions towards it. But one aspect that I do want to understand, because this 2014, 2016 is when you talked about some of the fraud that you observed. I'm not sure whether you still have connection to that area or whether you have personal experiences of fraudsters committing fraud, right? Type of fraud changed from a fraudster perspective. I'm not talking about the fraud prevention technology here. I'm talking about
Mhm.
have fraudsters changed?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And the unfortunate answer is in the middle, yes and no. So mostly what fraudsters do is, they just get some information, whether it's credit card details or somebody's identities, right? So that part didn't change. What changed is it became harder to commit fraud, right? There are like companies, they have scorecards now, they have very fast moving teams that either point out that hey, that's fraud. There is so many fraud prevention companies that provide lots of data on applications, and it's so fast paced environment that it is easier for companies to figure out which is fraud or not. But at the same time, fraudsters, they are definitely getting better and they're figuring out how things work. So it's like a game of cat and mouse. It's never ending game. They will be one step ahead, you will be one step ahead, and they evolve and you evolve.
Mhm. So one of the key things is my at least my belief is that the opportunistic fraud or people who stumble upon a way to fraud has gone down, but a very motivated person, a very organized or a well-funded team of people who are doing most of the fraud that we observe at this point. So because 10 years ago, because opportunity fraud for you to stumble across some sort of opportunity was very high. I believe now, because of all the solutions that are out there, the opportunistic fraud itself has gone down, but more in organized fraud. That's my view. So, is that what you observe as well when you are fighting fraud?
Right, right. So that is actually totally valid statement, and it is correct because it's like survival of the fittest. Now, lots of entry level, let's just say entry level fraudsters, right? They will get flagged by any companies, right? But those fraudsters who are like career fraudsters, they focus on it. They have a team, and their job is just to do that 8, 10 hours a day. They are way ahead of everyone, right? And they might be even on par of your level. So it's that 1% of fraudsters that you want to fight, and that's an interesting game.
Okay, okay, perfect. So I wanted to go back to your journey itself here. I took a detour based on your experience. It was super interesting that you came from that background and you know firsthand how frauds. I mean, I can also understand because it may be glorified in such neighborhoods. You made 1 million today, and so like yes, right. You have friends who would be like celebrating a fraud that has happened, and they made some money out of it, right? So I can totally relate to that, and it's a fascinating journey that you have had from there to here, right? So one of the things that I wanted to understand is you started your journey in non-financial, non-fraud space, right? And then you slowly worked your way towards the fraud itself, right? Was it something that you actively pursued, or was it something that you stumbled upon? I see that you did data analysis, which is kind of similar. Seems like this skill set seems similar, but the domain seems to have changed to fraud itself, right? Wanted to understand from different industries, different roles that you ended up in the fraud space.
So I would say I just stumbled upon it, and just it was the correct time, 2020. that the PPP fraud was happening, and just I just want to help. And I already had the fraud domain knowledge from the outside, and then the job skills it matched. You gotta know like some SQL, Excel, right, some data analysis, and I just felt like I was the perfect fit, and I would appreciate the company, Funbox. They gave me a chance, and we've done really amazing things there, and we were pretty successful at what we did in that company. So definitely for them also, it was they hired someone without the exactly fraud experience on the paper, and but we did well.
You had the experience, not in the traditional sense that they were looking for. Coming, being on the prevention side, on the other side of the table, right now, you're trying to prevent the fraud, but you've seen on the other side how they are operating, right? What was your biggest frustration? Because I'm sure you felt that this is something that can be stopped. It's pretty. I mean, you also mentioned in the initial few minutes that you were like thinking, why are people not able to stop or not stopping this, right? What was the disconnect that you felt when you were connecting between the outside world and the inside world of fraud prevention?
Right, right. So for a disconnect, I would name two things. So first of all, is companies have structures, right? They have different teams. As a fraud prevention team, your job is to mitigate fraud losses for the company, right? But there are other teams like sales, for example. They have their, goals to meet. They have their quotas, and in some cases, it might look like you're working against them, right? They have a good deal that if it gets approved, they will get their bonuses, or just company will reach the next milestone while you are stopping it from happening because your job is to mitigate fraud losses. So that was conflict of interest within the company was one of the disconnects. And second is, now companies, they want to rely on data, right? Everything has to be backed by data until you either adjust your models, or there has to be a proof. But let's say if you're coming from outside and you know how it happens, right? You want to be proactive and take measures before it happens, but there's no proof, right? So that is a big disconnect of other risk teams or senior executives not understanding what might happen, because you don't yet have the proof, the data proof that this happened. Now we need to adjust this. And so it's two approaches, right? Reactive and proactive. By being proactive, you use your knowledge and make a strategy. And reactive is you react after things happen. So that was one of the biggest disconnects there for sure.
Okay, so that reminds like a minority report, right? I mean, basically, you're trying to predict that somebody is going to do fraud, but you don't. The person has not yet done fraud, right? That's the
Correct,
philosophical
correct.
question that Minority Report also touches upon. I mean, the moment you said that, that's what I connected in my head, that it has not yet happened, and how do you convict somebody or stop somebody from doing something that they have not done yet,
Right,
right? That's really
right.
fascinating. I wanted to understand a little bit more about a topic that you talked about, which is a conflict of interest. Maybe my understanding is not 100% there. Would be great if you can add a little bit more about what you mean by conflict of interest here.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. And thank you for asking, because that I think that was one of the uh, biggest challenges of my career. I'm not going to mention which company was it, but companies go through, and I'm pretty sure lots of companies go through changes, right? And when changes happen, there are lots of departments like sales and operations or risk. There's even like risk has credit department and things like that. So like teams sometimes get shifted from one department to another, right? That's when you start feeling the conflict of interest. So I think fraud has to be on the risk side, because you are, mitigating risk. Fraud is a function of risk, right? But if you put fraud under sales, right, you report to sales your performance is against their goals, right? Like say you just right. So that's a huge conflict of interest. And now, your manager who's gonna do your performance review, for example, will see that you are working against them. And I think that's a huge conflict of interest, right? If you are not let's say you have a great performance in the risk mitigating, you have very low, false positive uh, rates, and you have a decent amount of rejections for fraud related, and that will look like you've rejected a lot of good deals that might have passed, and for the other team, they will question that, and their goal is to push more applications while your is different. So those two teams, I think, of course, they will coexist in the same company, but they shouldn't be under the same umbrella. That causes huge conflict of interests, and sometimes people might say, "Hey, I just need one deal to pass through so I can meet my quotas. Can you just make this pass through?" And now, like, that's a conflict of interest.
Got it, got it. So, can I understand, because this also reminds me about the different domains that you work, even within financial services. Fundbox is more SME, A2B is more different industries, and right now you're working
Mhm.
on non-prime um, domain, right? So, what I'm understanding here is, let's say one deal, let's say you predict it to be possible fraud, and the sales wants to take this forward, right? My understanding is the fraud to legitimate customers or transactions is way more lopsided, like 99% or even more versus less than 1% fraud, right? Now, in that scenario, let's say 1% is being rejected, and 99% is still sales is still achieving, right? So I'm just trying to understand one deal, how much, let's say the deal that you are rejecting, I'm assuming the value is bigger, but it's still, as a deal, is one deal. So I wanted to understand what is that
Mhm.
disconnect basically. If rejecting one shouldn't have impacted so much of the 100% business, right? Because 99% is still legitimate business.
Right, right. So that's the I think that was the right question to ask, but it's not 99 to 1. It's more, right? But again, it's not that significant. But again, as for startups, right, you have very motivated goals for growth, right? Each deal counts, and you might have limited customers, especially in last 3 years, right? COVID, and now the economy, inflation, and the rates grown up. So, lots of if you look at the stock market, lots of fintechs they kind of went down. Thank God they're recovering, but companies weren't getting
Too many
huge
customers.
numbers
Okay.
of customers,
Mm, mm,
right?
mm.
So that's why everything counts, right? And then again, you can't ignore the fact of the fraud risk. You don't want to lose money on anything, especially in those times, right? So I think that's when people put their goals first rather than companies' goals, right? And that causes the conflict of interest.
Got it, got it. So I wanted to get back to the different domains as well. So you worked in the SME in the fund box, right? Do correct me if I'm my understanding of the focus of these companies itself. A2B is more logistics based payments, right? And then finally, the company that you are currently working with is into non-prime customers, right? I'm assuming that the volumes are significantly different, and the fraud risk or the amount that you lose because of fraud transaction or per customer is probably very different as well,
Mhm.
right? So how do you deal with these differences, and how do you personally, because when you are moving from one industry to one domain to another, how are you also picking up these skills?
So that's the interesting part.
Hmm.
On both companies where I worked, where I was the fraud team lead, our fraud losses were minimal.
Hmm.
It's minimal that you could be proud of it. So even though they provided different products, fraud would stop on the onboarding, right? So I led the fraud team, and we focused on onboarding first because that's when you board the bad customers,
Hmm.
right? That's when you board the fraudulent customers, and you could count with your hands if how many fraudulent customers we had. So on that aspect, we were really strong team. Our rejection rates were very low. Most of the accounts would turn out to be false positives, and yeah, even though those are different industries, but the MOs of the fraud, it's still the same. It's a stolen identity, deceiving that you are the person, and getting the card or the loan and just run away.
Hmm.
And it doesn't happen under our watch.
Okay, got it, got it, got it. Oh, stolen identity and somebody takes a car on mortgage and runs away with the car. That's one of the mods that you talked about, right?
Right,
Okay,
right.
okay, got it, got it. So this gives me a good idea of. So can I understand what are the you talked about identity? What are the types of fraud that you see that's like the most prevalent? What type of fraud, if you say, is the majority that you see in the market itself?
Right, right. That's a very good question, also. So I would say, and I am 100% sure lots of experts in the industry would agree, it's going to be identity fraud because it's just so easy to do it. The information out there is available, right? So if you look at the biggest data breaches, right, like T-Mobile, for example, there was a huge database space breach of their clients where names like personal identifiable information like social security numbers would be out there, and somebody has all that data and probably is selling it on the dark web or any other marketplaces, right? So lots of big companies there were victim of data breaches, and that made personal information more accessible to the fraudsters, and you can buy it probably anywhere. So identity theft it's most common type of fraud, and for fintechs and other financial institutions, the goal is to identify who is the customer. Is that the real customer, or it's something that has the identity of the customer? And that's an ongoing battle. Lots of things have been developing in that world, but again, people figure out on the other side.
What are the technologies that you are using to prevent the same thing? Got it, got it. So can I also understand? You did talk about the key decision that you're making is whether this is the customer that he claims to be, or he or she claims to be, versus somebody else taking somebody else's or impersonation of the identity itself. So, what are some of the key techniques that you have used that you think are very effective in being able to differentiate these two uh, approaches here?
Right. So that is the one question that I don't want to disclose, because if
Okay,
people on the other side watch this, they would know.
no worries.
But I would say that
Uh,
there are lots of companies, right, that do or help in fraud prevention. They provide data on every data points, right, and then a lot of them are, I would say, not so great, but there are really great ones that do and help a lot all the financial institutions. So when you combine all the data points, right, that's when you can classify people into some categories, less risky, more risky, and needs review. And just the data on the fraud prevention have got much better. And I expect there's going to be more companies who do a really good work in that area. But yeah, so it's all about the data. You build scorecards based on that, and you can make really fast decisions on identifying whether if the customer is real or not.
Got it. Got it. Understand. So I also want to understand here. I mean, I saw the FTC data and their report, right? I mean, the fraud is growing quite rapidly, like 50% year on year in 2022, right? I wanted to understand from your personal experiences, the companies that you worked with, have you seen a decrease in fraud or an increase in fraud? Because I see that there's a lot of fraud prevention technologies, right? A lot of new solutions, a lot of innovative solutions coming out there, right? So I just wanted to understand. I see a lot of reports that the fraud is growing quite rapidly. I mean, from FTC, it's about 50% year on year in 2022. And I also see a lot of fraud prevention companies, lots of innovative technologies coming up. We also talked about a lot of fraud data getting better, right? So, from your personal experience, can I understand if the fraud is decreasing or growing? If it is growing, I want to understand a little bit more about the reasons of why, even after doing all this, the fraud is growing.
Right. So I think the simple answer would be the market, right? The supply and demand for those fraud prevention companies increased significantly. And if you look at the FTC report, fraud is growing, right? But I think that's that's not all the numbers. Actually, fraud is skyrocketing. It is so easy to access everything now, right? People are, we live age of the space age technology called the internet. Everyone has access to it, right? And you can find everything on the internet. So it is definitely really easy to commit fraud, and especially for young people right now. Even if you search, there are some rappers who rap about fraud, which for me it seemed hilarious. And they like on their songs they go through the steps, and there are people on social media that show the amount of money they made with fraud. That's how they get caught. But again, that's influencing the young minds, right? You think, hey, what if I do this? Like, this seems like a good lifestyle. And for whoever that's listening, most of them they get caught, right? So it's not the best thing to do, obviously. But yeah, it's so easy to do. And if you're on the other side, right, for people that don't have much opportunities, maybe like 10, 20 years ago, selling drugs was a thing, right, to make money. But and that's dangerous, right? But now you can do it behind the computer. You can just do fraud, steal some money from here and there. Again, you're gonna get caught, but it's easier.
So, if I understand this, what you're saying that the technology or the availability of technology has enabled fraudsters or access to technology has enabled this. So, at the same time, I mean, as companies, as financial institutions, our access to technology also has grown, right? I mean, until I mean, if I understand you correctly, that the pace at which the fraudsters are adopting technology is better than at the pace at which financial institutions are adopting the technology. That's the difference, and that's the gap where the growth of fraud is happening. I wanted to understand because technology is available to both financial institutions and fraudsters.
Correct, correct. So, yeah, so technology has grown for both, right? There are lots of companies that help, or companies have, good tech talent that can build something in house, right, for prevention. But when you look at the number of people that committed fraud, right, or commit fraud, it increased dramatically. And, most of them fail, obviously, because the protections are good. But people learn there are, like, if you search on Google how to commit fraud, right, I'm pretty sure you will get thousands of results, and there will be forums that discuss that thing just in open wide, right? There are channels on Telegram that is just made for fraudsters. People find new MOs, they succeeded, they start selling their ebooks or like tutorials on how to commit fraud, and it will get patched, and most of the things are online is patched already, right? But again, people learn from that, people build on top of it, and it's an ongoing battle. But I feel like the number of people who commit fraud increased significantly. That's why the fraud prevention services, every year there is new one. A lot of them, I don't think they are doing a really good job, but there are numbers of few that are exceptional.
Okay, okay, got it. And what are some of the key technologies? I see that you have data analysis background, right? You also talked about SQL and Excel, right? So, what are some of the technologies as a fraud analyst that you need? Some of the skill sets that you need to be a very effective fraud prevention specialist.
Yeah, so just imagine that you have data, right? You have lots of data points from lots of different vendors, and you want to identify which is, which works and which doesn't. So some knowledge and statistics, right? Running regressions, understanding storytelling with data, and understanding what exactly each point is doing, what is being helpful for, identifying fraud and what is not. And from there, just build up the model or just alerts, right? So yeah, I think I'm kind of lost in the question, but just regular data analysis and understanding how things work that will help you to identify either a category of fraudsters or fraudsters by just data.
Yep, understand. So, what I wanted to understand is one is the technical side of things. The other is the MO you talked about, MO of fraud itself, right? I'm assuming that is slightly different depending on the domain, right? A car mortgage company or insurance company sees it differently compared to a wallet company, right? So I'm assuming there is a combination of your technical skill sets as well as the understanding of the business itself. So that's what I wanted to understand. How do you go about training somebody with the domain knowledge itself? You came from that background, so probably it came naturally to you. Wanted to understand in your teams itself, how do you train people on the domain? Technical skills, I'm assuming, is something that there is extensive training programs available.
Right. So training on domain knowledge is, for people in that who work in fraud prevention, right? They need to think like fraudsters. Let's say if you were a fraudster and you have this information, how would you use it, right? And sometimes you find ways that you are actually exposed, right? And then from there, maybe you create your own MO that might be an MO in future for them, right? So definitely thinking like a fraudster that will help you to understand and be one step ahead, and just understand how fraud works, why people do it, where they get the information, what can they do it, and that's all you need.
Understand. So I also see one debate about when fraud happens from a customer point of view, a legitimate customer point of view. It is very easy for a customer to blame the company because the company does not have a face, to blame that the fault lies with the company, right? And obviously that's a spectrum, right? There is some mistakes happening from the customer side. There is some probably holes from the company side as well, and essentially leaving the gap for the fraudster to get in, right? In such scenarios, how do you handle because it's a very intricate discussion with the customer. Obviously, the customer is going to blame it on you to get back all the money, right? How do you handle this conversation? Is the fraud team that handle this conversation, or is the frontline teams that handle this conversation?
So it's a mixture of frontline teams and the fraud team. But from my perspective, right, if let's say there is a normal person living out there, living their normal lives, and let's just say somebody applied to a loan on their name, got the loan and run away, and now this person who is a victim is calling your company, right? I would say that's 100% on company, because first of all, you had all the means to stop the fraud from happening, right? You don't want to leave a person who is just a victim who didn't do anything wrong with, like, say, $10,000 $20,000 of debt, right? They didn't take it. So it's on the companies that had data breaches, right? That leaked the personal information of the company, and it's on your company as well, because if you had proper tools, if you had proper models that would separate, like whether to send the application to manual review, you had so many steps before the loan was taken out, right? So I'm always on, not always, but sometimes customers, they like to play a victim, but when it's not the customers, and it's easy to know because you have all the data. It's company's fault. That's how you learn. That's how you improve your methodologies and methods. But yeah, I think people who are real victims out there, they shouldn't suffer from companies' fault.
Mm, mm. Okay, wonderful. So, well, I want to ask the final question. I want to understand, how do you see the future of the fraud going forward in the financial institutions
I
itself?
think that is a really good question, and thanks for asking. But I think the fraud will grow rapidly, will continue growing rapidly, just because of the available sources out there, and just looking at the trend, it is growing nonstop. It is easy to commit. It's not easily easy to commit successfully, but it's easily to get your hands on the information. And there's lots of outside influences that is kind of encouraging people to do it. And there are very few numbers of people who kind of succeeded doing it. And young kids might think, oh, that is the way to have a good life, but that's not the case. Most of the criminals, they get caught, and there's a pretty good chain of command that is enforcing the financial crimes. So yeah, unfortunately, I think it will still grow, and the way to fight it, build a better scorecard, is either improving your models or having new features or data set, right? And I expect other startups to come up in the fraud prevention space and add their values into it, and that's something that I really want to see.
Hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Asad, for your time and also your insights into fraud and technologies and your experiences, personal experiences as well. It's wonderful to have you, and would love to have you some of the time into the podcast as well. Thank you, Asad.
Definitely,
For all
Ravi,
the
and
listeners, yeah, go ahead.
and thank you
Hmm,
for inviting me
hmm,
to this
hmm.
podcast, to your first chapter.
Last guest,
And
yeah.
yeah, thank you. I'm humbled.
Thank you so much to you too as well. And for all the listeners, please do subscribe to our podcast as well as you can like our LinkedIn page uh, that we'll share after this podcast itself. Thank you so much and have a nice day.